to Season 3 of HistoHelp, the podcast series with tips, tricks, and solutions to the common and not so common problems in the lab. In this season, we're going to expand on your tech knowledge, talk about a polar bear, and figure out some interesting training ideas for hard tissue. Thanks for listening, and enjoy! Welcome to part 2 of AI in the lab. In this episode, Dave and Adam are going to break down more about how artificial intelligence and a digital solution are impacted by multiplexing, and how multiplexing is impacted by an artificial intelligence or digital solution. Dave and Adam are also going to talk a little bit more about the challenges labs face in both the clinical and research environments when implementing an artificial intelligence solution.
How is AI and image analysis tackling the new wave of multiplexing that we're seeing, the resurgence of multiplex chromogens as well as multiplex fluorescence?
Yeah, it's interesting in image analysis. I think the multiplexing is probably more complicated on the wet lab side of things and getting it right and sort of validating it there. For us in the image analysis side of things, if you have a multiplex fluorescent image, it really doesn't matter to us whether it's a single channel. It could be DAPI and FITSI, or it could be DAPI and 50 other channels. And because they're already separated sort of in that fluorescent space or in that IMC space, it's really just another layer for us. So the complexity of it really is setting up that assay and validating, each of those markers, each of those antibodies that are then building that multiplex panel. I mean, on the bright field side of things, it becomes a little bit more complicated for image analysis, because with color deconvolution, you're trying to separate all the colors on the slide and sort of isolate those, especially when you have co-localization of the markers. And so, again, it kind of goes back to the validation of the assay in the first place in setting it up in the labs, making sure your antibodies are specific, and then selecting chromogens that you're going to be able to separate. We unfortunately will get, and this probably actually goes back to your sort of utilizing all your resources early on, but we'll get this 5-plex chromogenic panel that clearly someone spent a lot of time putting this together and validating it. But then for chromogen selections, it's like purple, blue, teal on on a hematoxylin stained counter stain, and to the eye, like, it looks really nice and everything's sort of matching and they're in the same family, and for a poster it probably looks great, but for image analysis, separating those colors is really challenging because they all have blue somewhere in there. And so it really becomes a challenge to separate those out. So again, thinking through early in the game, how those colors are going to relate to one another, ultimately, just to separate those out. Thinking about the color wheel and sort of looking at different quadrants of it when you're selecting your chromogens is really critical. And so as you're bringing image analysis into the assay earlier and earlier, it's going to make it easy for you downstream as well, because now that these colors are going to separate. That the intensity of the staining is such that you can get that separation. And so bringing that in as early as possible is going to give you the best results, as opposed to, like I said, sort of this finalized 5-plex assay that's been stained for 100 slides and you can't go back and restain it. It's one of the hardest support calls for me to say there's not much we can do here because everything's blue. It pains me to say it, but so the earlier you can start thinking about image analysis and pulling it in as you're building those assays, the better the data is going to be downstream.
And I think a lot of what drove the multiplexing as far as the chromogens go were the current environment within the diagnostic space, where pathologists would have a bright field microscope on their desk, and they were used to going from the H&E bright field image directly to the chromogens. So historically, it's been things like TAB, the brown chromogen, and AEC. And now, like you said, we have this revolution now where we're getting these purple and yellow and teal and green, which is great if you're going to be reading it by eye and you're not concerned about measuring co-localization. because when you do have multiple chromogens that are overlapped, it becomes almost impossible to tease out the different markers that are co-expressing. And we know that from various user experience that DAB has this umbrella effect where it can mask other markers as well, and so it can prevent the binding of other antibodies to that particular site, and so you can get this hindrance, steric hindrance that happens just because these large chromogen molecules inhibiting the binding of future antibodies, and that's actually been confirmed using spectral mixing. So Akoya has their Vector Polaris and allows you to do spectral libraries and do some mixing, and you can actually see what look to be vacuoles or holes where you would expect to see colocalization, but because the antibody wasn't able to bind, it leaves this empty space where there should be some positive staining. And so I think my lab is, as well as many other labs that are involved in multiplex staining, have gone to fluorescence approaches for that reason. And it really allows you to turn off channels and turn them back on again, so you can really clearly see those overlapping signals. And the software is built to do the quantitation of each of the channels, and also get the phenotypes where you can find the overlapping of those signals. And the other change that's happened, this revolution, is that now that we're in digital pathology, we can actually scan all these fluorescent images and present them directly to the pathologist through a network, through a server, and they can open it up on their desktop along with their bright field H&E and do the side-by-side comparison with the fluorescence and the H&E. And especially now during the pandemic, where people have been working from home, maybe they don't have access to a microscope, and many don't have access to a fluorescent microscope as well. And so to be able to just send them the whole slide scans of the digital images with the H&Es allows a more efficient way to process those images and then feed that information into a report or do further image analysis on those samples. So I think we do have a somewhat of a culture shift now, kind of a revolution where we're getting more acceptive of digital pathology and being able to diagnose cases on the East Coast and have a secondary review or peer review with somebody on the West Coast through the digital pathology, and they can have a discussion around the findings. And if it's a very difficult test as well, then you could have that consultant provide maybe some additional feedback on what's being shown there. And for your experience, Adam, with working with your clients, have you seen that shift to more fluorescence, or do you see it kind of like evenly divided between bright field and fluorescence? What's your experience?
Yeah, we still see a pretty strong mix of it. I think
Okay.
initially the fluorescent scanners were pretty low throughput.
Yeah.
I think the Aperio FL was one of the first ones that I remember being on the market, and that was the capacity was 4 slides. And so to prep 4 slides, have them scanned, pull those off, put another 4 on, the throughput's just very low. And I would say in the past 5 years or so, there are some higher capacity scanners that have come around that sort of allow for more scaling up. But I think in general, we see a lot of the discovery work sort of set up in that multiplex space, where it's maybe smaller scale studies, proof of concept, some validation, and trying to find those relationship of what's important from that panel. Is it a specific type of immune cell? Is it a specific colocalization? What's the sort of key piece we're looking for? And then translating that into chromogenic staining for a more simplified assay that you can then scale up and scan, I think, Leica has a 450 slide capacity scanner at this point that actually allows you to run it around the clock, because you can just kind of pull one stack off and put another stack of slides on as it's going, so you don't have to stop anything. So you can really up the throughput, and I think that ultimately then lends to the clinical space, where you have labs where they have several of those types of scanners that you're just cranking those through. That I don't think with fluorescence you can quite have that throughput, because not only are you worrying about the sort of the lifespan of that fluorescence signal, but you're also you're scanning the slide multiple times. So if you have an 8-plex panel, you're essentially scanning it eight times to get each channel, and so it really slows down the throughput, even on a slide scanner that holds, could hold hundreds of slides. You still got to scan it 8 times to get the image for each channel. So we've seen the capacity and the throughput increase in the fluorescence space, but I think ultimately the goal for true scale up ends up going back into the chromogenic space, it seems.
So do you see that the fluorescence is more applicable to research environments only, or do you see diagnostic labs starting to use fluorescence as well?
I would say predominantly, in my experience anyway, I've seen it mostly in research, but starting to see, I guess, more curiosity and more investigation into being able to use it in a clinical or diagnostic space. Starting to kind of dabble in that area, from what I've seen anyway.
Yeah, and I guess, like you said, the limitation would be the time. I think that's maybe inhibiting some of those diagnostic labs where they're really trying to get that fast turnaround time, fast reporting, and so they potentially could see fluorescence as being a slower process, and because of that, they wouldn't be as open to it, and it would be an initial actual investment too, to get the capital to buy the hardware that's needed for this too, and the additional training that would be required. So one of the things that I've been really in favor of is continuing to provide educational opportunities within the NSH to help the technical staff to learn these techniques and to raise awareness of these type of instruments and processes where we could collect these type of fluorescent readouts. And so they would at least be more aware of the change, and they could maybe feed it up to their leadership team and eventually bring this kind of continue the revolution, if you will, of this technology.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we've been primarily focused in research up until probably about a year or so ago. And so, we see pretty much everything that you see in the clinic or in a diagnostic space started in research. You don't just start out as a diagnostic tool, right?
Yep.
And so it's pretty interesting. It's pretty cool to see that build. And so it's been good for us as well to kind of build evidence in the research space for the software and for the assays, and to see that kind of follow through into the clinic. And now we're starting to head there as well with the software. And really the whole time, being focused in the research, like you said, you're sort of building really a pile of evidence that you can then take to the folks on the diagnostic side, on the clinical side, and sort of show, this is what we've been working on, this is what it does, this is where it's going. And it's not just theoretical at that point, right? There's actually a pile of practical data that you have on hand, which is great.
All right. Well, I do appreciate your time talking about this topic, Adam. It was really interesting, and to see your insights. As we kind of wrap up, I'm interested to know what you see as the biggest struggles right now for labs adopting this type of technology, this AI approach.
Yeah, I think right now it's been sort of in the, I guess, twofold. Like in the hardware space is one.
Okay, hardware.
Getting computers that are capable of the GPU processing power. So that's been one, and that's actually been challenging even for customers to get the hardware in. Even if you're purchasing it, you have budget for it, the supply chain right now is kind of, it's crimped a little bit. So the turnaround time, if you want to buy a graphics card, it might be 5 to 6 months until they can deliver it. I think between the pandemic, Bitcoin mining, things like that, they're pretty high demand,
Yeah.
and the supply is sort of tough. So that's sort of one piece of it. And we're actually looking into more and more networks where you can leverage traditional CPU processing. So you don't necessarily need that that higher scale computing in order
Okay.
to leverage AI. So that's one of the areas that we're trying to build into, and finding some new networks for that. And then the other side, the other challenge, I think, has been customers providing the training data for the network. So again, our approach has been to kind of give a shell of a network, and then the customer provides their training data of what is a tumor and what's not a tumor. And kind of the reason we've taken that approach is that in AI or any machine learning, someone needs to teach the computer what the ground truth is, right? And so in our case, it's histology images. And so that data has to come from somewhere. And so we can't take GSK's customer data, build a
Right.
network that segments tumor, and then sell it to another pharma company. Like that
Yeah.
just won't
Yeah. Yeah.
fly. And it's
Yep.
been a bit of a matter of contention, I guess, in the space of, well, where's this data coming from, and who's supplying it, and then where's that being used? And so we've sort of erred on the side of letting them build it. So what that requires is then that you have to supply lots and lots of training data that's coming from the pathologist or coming from the labs, and you're supplying that data. And so that's been a bit of, I guess, a hurdle for adoption, is sort of not investing the time to supply. I mean, pathologists have better things to do than draw on a screen all day,
Right.
right?
Right.
But it's needed along the way, and so supplying that training data. And so again, we're starting to work and build some collaborations with labs to
Okay.
provide some more pre-built algorithms, so sort of application specific. So looking at some different tumor types to have sort of a pre-built network that can identify colorectal cancer or something along those lines. And so we've been working with some labs and building some agreements in place where we'd be able to use their expertise, use their training knowledge. They're compensated for it, and it's going to become a commercial product. So that's sort of one of the areas where we're trying to lower that barrier of adoption of needing to provide the training data yourself.
I wonder if there's an opportunity within university hospitals, like teaching hospitals, where they may be running on grants and things like that. So if they could get maybe a grant to work on this type of a project, or I wonder through the NIH if there's something that could be done there to build up.
Yeah, that's I didn't feed you that question, I promise.
Okay.
That's exactly where we're looking and working
Oh,
with
okay.
collaborators
Yeah.
and trying to
Yeah.
academic labs, you sort of have much more willing to work with vendors and supply sort of group source
Right.
data, and to be able to leverage that for access to product on their end. So it works out as a really nice synergistic relationship where we're able to build those products.
That's great. Well, I'm glad I asked the question. So yeah, I didn't know that you were prepared to answer that. So that's great. So if somebody wants to learn more about AI or image analysis or validation, that type of stuff, where do you recommend that they go to find out more information?
I mean, on our website, indicalab.com, we have a learning portal there for customers to go in. We have sort of some AI webinars that are there, some nice introductions to the material. There's the AI presentation that I gave at the NSH conference this year. I'm assuming there's a recording of that available
Yeah.
somewhere. And then even on YouTube, there's some nice channels there. I think it's three brown, one blue. I think is the one guy. He's a Stanford mathematician who's got just some phenomenal videos on AI and really breaking it down and simplifying it that even I can understand. I think a lot of times when you get into the math of it, my eyes kind of glaze over, and
Me too.
it's over my head. It's not,
Yep.
and so he really breaks it down into a more practical, sort of digestible way of explaining things. So I think there's some
Nice.
really good resources like that. And again, I think going back to that original differentiation that I made between AI for image analysis versus sort of the data processing side of things,
Yeah.
making sure you're looking at the right side of that when you're
Okay.
looking, and not getting sort of bogged down into the data. um, and yeah, there's a lot of those resources out there that are available.
And maybe in the block we could list a number of educational programs that we have, webinars or other presentations that would allow people to go more in depth into this topic. All right. Any final comments before we close?
No, just thanks for the invite. It was great to catch up and chat a little bit. And but yeah, that's I think that covers it.
We hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you have a tip, trick, or piece of knowledge you'd like to share, let us know. We would love to feature you on a future episode of HistoHelp. Have a great day! Yahtzee!